Welcome to Module 6 in 289M here at PCC. Your instructor Robert McMillan, and we just got finished talking about some deep dive into group policy, and now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about domain controllers and Active Directory management. So let's see what we got in store. Active Directory key concepts, how to clone a virtual domain controller, configure a read-only domain controller, configure sites, work with operations master roles, and maintain AD. So we're going to also take a look at domain controllers that are servers that have Windows Server OS installed and configured. And of course, the domain controllers depend on DNS to work properly for Active Directory. One domain controller per domain is required, but having two is recommended. So this is a little bit of a review. DCs maintain data consistency in Active Directory with other DCs by using replication. Read-only domain controllers are DCs where AD changes cannot be written, usually in a remote office. Global catalogs, we talked a lot about those, holds all of Active Directory in it. AD is based on the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP. AD tree is made up of one or more domains that share a common top level and second level domain name. AD forest consists of one or more trees with domains that share a common trust relationship. So we talked about mergers and acquisitions when you need to trust Active Directory. An AD site is a physical location in which DCs communicate and replicate information frequently. So let's take a look at read-only domain controllers. An RODC, read-only domain controller, performs many of the same tasks as a regular domain controller, but you can't make changes to the RODC. So if anybody wants to add a user, for instance, in a location where a read-only domain controller sits, the changes won't take place on the local RODC because it can't. It will go up to the parent and then be replicated back down to the RODC. So prerequisites, you can't just install it, you have to have some things going. You have to have a writable DC running at least Windows Server 2008 or later. And the forced functional level must be at least Windows 2003. So probably just about 100% of all sites will qualify for that. In Windows Server 2008 R2, you must use the add prep RODC prep, read-only domain controller prep, command before you install the RODC if the function level isn't 2008 or later. Otherwise, you cannot make a read-only domain controller. Run the Active Directory configuration wizard and you select the read-only domain controller option. We'll be doing that in our lab where we select that RODC option. You'll then move to the RODC options window where you can select the delegated administrator account. So we're going to use our same administrator as usual. So this is what it looks like. This is the difference between a writable domain controller and a read-only domain controller. That checkbox right there. So if you don't check that box, it's going to be writable. So you've got to check that box if that's what you want. Then, of course, you have to put in the directory services restore mode, password, just like you always do, and then continue on. So this is the wizard that continues. You have to choose the accounts that are allocated to replicate passwords to the RODC, and then you're going to create a password replication group to do that. Now, there's accounts that are denied from replicating passwords as well. So you've got unidirectional replication when you have an RODC, and that's because the replication only happens from the writable controller to the read-only controller, not the other way around. You have a filtered attribute set, which is a collection of attributes data configured on the schema master. And it's used to specify domain objects that are not going to be replicated to the DC. So the RODC doesn't get everything, only what it needs. So you don't want to have an RODC in the same location as a writable domain controller. Most of the time, or almost all the time, what we do is we put an RODC in a remote office where we don't want to have to worry that someone's going to go in and mess with our Active Directory. But we don't want users to authenticate across a slow WAN connection. We want them to authenticate local in their office, which is why we have an RODC. Password replication policies. You can specify accounts for which passwords will be replicated. If you don't have a password replicated to the RODC, then it will just go to the writable domain controller to get that information, which could take longer to authenticate you when you log on. Password replication is controlled by the password replication policies, and you've got a list with allow or deny settings. So this is what it looks like. You've got the read-only domain controller, store users and computer passwords according to this policy. So you choose which ones you're going to deny. And you see most of those are denied. You don't want to have the administrator and other people with administrative access to be replicated down to that RODC because that could get compromised. Remember, you're only putting RODCs in areas where you think that it's going to be an unsecure situation. Read-only DNS. If you install DNS on RODC, all AD integrated DNS zones are read-only, so they're not going to be able to make any changes there locally. Zone information is replicated from other DNS servers, but zone changes can't be made on the RODC, so it effectively makes them secondary zones. Secondary zones cannot be written to. To maintain the current DNS database, the request from the RODC requests a single record replications from the DNS server that update the client record. You cannot create a new AD integrated zone on an RODC. So here we have a picture here. On the left-hand side, we've got the Chicago site. On the right-hand side, we have the New Orleans site. So we've got a slow link between these sites. So let's talk about site components. Sites and connections between sites are defined by a number of components, such as the subnets, the site links, and the bridgehead servers. So we're moving away from the RODC. We're moving on now to sites. Subnets. After creating a site, you must associate one or more subnets with it. AD uses this information in two ways, placing new domain controllers in the correct site and determining which site a client computer belongs to. So the purpose of having sites, as shown in this particular graphic, is when people go to log on from the New Orleans site, we don't want them authenticating to the Chicago site. It'll take too long. It's a slow WAN link. So we want them to authenticate from the New Orleans site. So that's why we create these sites. All right, so let's take a look here at the first default first site name properties. This is created when you, first create Active Directory on your first domain. It creates this default first site properties. But if you want to create additional sites, you can call them by their physical location, and you can even rename the default first site name if you want to match the physical location as well. But you've got to apply a subnet. So you can see here that there's a subnet of 192.168.0.0 applied to it. So that means if you are a client computer and you want to log into, authenticate into the domain, then it knows which domain controller to send you to, based on what subnet you're in. So the site link is needed to connect two or more sites for replication purposes. So when you add a domain controller in a new site, it automatically creates this new site link. So when AD is installed, this default site link is created. Until new site links are created, all sites that are added use this site link. So even if you don't create an additional site, let's say you leave everybody in the default site, even though they're physically in different locations. They will replicate with each other. Users will be able to log on. But the problem is that sometimes, say if we use Portland and Seattle as an example, if you are in the Portland office, it's going to use round robin as to which domain controller it's going to use to authenticate you. So user 1 authenticates to the Portland domain controller. User 2, even though he's in Portland, is authenticating to the Seattle domain controller. Well, that's going to take a lot longer to log on. So if you create a site for each Portland and Seattle, then you can alleviate that issue. They'll only log into the domain controller to which they're attached. And that's what you do with these site links. So here we see the default site link properties. Sites not in this link, sites in this link, and you can see that the default first site name is in there. You also can set up a cost as well and how often it should replicate. Bridgehead server. The InterSite topology generator designates a bridgehead server to replicate a partition with other sites. You can also override automatic assignment of a bridgehead server. So it used to be that there were no bridgehead servers unless you manually assigned them back in the 2000 days. So now what happens is Windows says, hey, I'm not going to do this mesh replication between all these different sites and all these different domain controllers. I'm going to go ahead and designate one of these domain controllers, typically the first one installed, to be the bridgehead. So if I've got 3 domain controllers in Portland, 3 domain controllers in Seattle, Microsoft Windows Server 2016 is automatically going to set up one DC in each office to replicate back and forth to. And then the Seattle bridgehead server is responsible for letting the other DCs in its office to know the replication information, just like Portland is as well. Let's talk about global catalogs. Global catalog is the only place where universal group membership information is maintained. So we talked about what a universal group is before, but just as a refresher, universal groups are created when there are multiple forests and domains, and you want to add users or groups to these universal groups so they have access to file shares or other resources in all of the domains and all of the forests. And it's only kept in the global catalog, and so that could be a quiz alert for you. Universal group membership caching stores universal group membership, so the global catalog server doesn't have to be contacted for every user logon. So operations masters. You've got several different ones. We touched on these a little bit in a previous module, but now let's go ahead and talk about what they're used for. Domain naming master is a forest-wide master role that manages adding, removing, and renaming domains in the forest. So if you're missing your domain naming master, you can't name anything. Schema master, that one's super important. It's a forest-wide FSMO role, master role, that's responsible for replicating the schema directory partition to all other domain controllers. The PDC emulator, another master role, and that processes password changes for older Windows clients and is used during authentications. So one of the reasons they can't get rid of this is because not just the older clients, but it's also used for authentication. RIDmaster, domain-wide FSMO role, is responsible for issuing unique pools of RIDs to each DC. So a domain-wide FSMO role responsible for issuing, let's see, RIDmaster has more than one role here, issuing unique pools of RIDs to each DC. So what does RID stand for? Relative Identifier. This is a unique value combined with a domain identifier to form the security identifier for an AD object. So everybody's got a SID, and the RIDmaster manages these. Infrastructure master, a domain-wide FSMO, again, master role, responsible for making changes made to object names in one domain are updated in reference to these objects in other domains. So that covers multiple domains. Now it says here that the infrastructure master role should not be held by DC that has the global catalog server. But that's really in a very large organization. Because by default, when you create your first domain controller, it's both a global catalog and it has all 5 of these master roles on it. So in a small server environment, it doesn't really matter. So if you don't have these master roles on servers that are up and running, then Active Directory starts acting funny. So in the beginning, everything will work okay. You won't really notice it. And then over time, you'll find you can't create users. It won't replicate to other servers. All kinds of problems happen when the server that's holding these master roles, or if you split them up and maybe one of the master roles is missing because the server went down, and you just didn't realize it at first. So for a little while, it will run okay until you start trying to make changes and replicating. Administrators should be familiar with the 2 important FSMO management operations. So you need to know how to transfer these operation roles, and you need to know how to seize them. So if you know one of your servers is going to be retired, or you want to go down for maintenance, then you can transfer the master roles to another server, or you can split them up into multiple servers. If that server that holds all the master roles goes down and it's not coming back because it's broken and you decide not to restore for backup, then you need to seize those roles onto another server in order for Active Directory to continue functioning properly. So reasons for transferring: DC performing the role was the first in the forest and holds all the domain and forest-wide roles. So a lot of times, once you install your first domain controller, a lot of times the administrator won't ever transfer them or split them up among other servers, especially in a small network. The DC performing role is being moved to a location isn't well suited for the role, so you'll need to move the role because of that. Current DC's performance is inadequate or taken out of service. So one restriction when transferring the roles, an RODC cannot be an FSMO role holder. So it's not going to have any of the roles. You don't have to worry about it. So here's all the different 5 roles once again, and the different ways you can transfer them. There's also these PowerShell commands as well. So you can move the AD directory server operations master role, and then you can type in the name of the domain controller and which role it is. There's also another command called ntdsutil, which came out before PowerShell was invented, and it allows you to move and transfer and seize as well. An operations master role is seized when the current role holder is no longer online because of some sort of failure, as I mentioned earlier. You can't use MMCs to seize a role. You've got to understand PowerShell or use the ntdsutil command shown in page 248. 2 folders that hold most of the components of Active Directory. The ntds, this folder is located in the system root. It has the ntds.dit file, and which is the Active Directory database. So you got to know where that is. Holds a log of AD transactions in the EDB log, and stores information about the last committed transaction in the EDB check file. Sysfile, this folder is located in the system root, which is just C:\Windows, and it contains group policy templates, log-on, log-off scripts, and DFS synchronization data. So when you back up your system state, you're going to get a backup of Active Directory. Or when you do a full backup, which includes the system state. Backup volumes containing system recovery information also causes the system state or Active Directory to get backed up. So you've got different types of backup methods. You can use Windows Server Backup, WBadmin, or PowerShell to back up and restore Active Directory. System state backup on a DC includes all these different files, and you'll definitely see that on a quiz. So be aware of those files. To perform a system state backup, run the Windows Server Backup tool or the WBadmin command. If you're going to use the Windows Server Backup tool, you do have to install it. It's not there by default. Even though it shows that it's there under the Tools menu, when you go to open it, it'll say it's not actually installed. So just install it as a role, just like anything else, a role or a feature. To perform most tasks with WBadmin command, you must be a member of the Backup Operators group. So if you're going to use the WBadmin command, you don't have to pre-install a role or service. So there's 2 different types of restores. There's a non-authoritative restore and an authoritative. So the non-authoritative method, restoring AD from a backup, that restores the database and allows the data to be updated through replication by other domain controllers. So you do this restoration, and if it's out of date, other domain controllers will update it automatically. So this option is preferable because it doesn't require a restart. Then you've got the authoritative restore. So what this does is it restores Active Directory, and then it pushes out its changes to all other domain controllers. So if the most up-to-date version of Active Directory and Global Catalog is on the server that you're doing the restore, then it's going to overwrite any changes to other domain controllers. So it's not necessarily the first one you want to go to unless you're for sure that this domain controller is the one with all of the great best information. All right, so how do we recover deleted objects from the recycle bin? We did cover this a little bit in a previous module, but there is a PowerShell command. You can do a restore AD object, ntdsutil command, but the easiest thing to do is to have the AD recycle bin enabled. Once you enable it, then it's very easy just to drag and drop or right click and choose restore the deleted objects. And it's not enabled by default, and when you go to enable it, make sure all your domain controllers are turned on. Online defragmentation. This typically only happens in very large organizations where a lot of changes cause fragmentation in the Active Directory database. So it removes deleted objects, frees up space, doesn't compact the database. It occurs automatically when AD performs garbage collection, and this happens every 12 hours. And it removes objects that have been deleted for more than 180 days. So even if your objects are in the recycle bin, it's going to be deleted after 180 days. Deleted objects that have not been removed are referred to as tombstoned. And the Tombstone lifetime by default is 180 days, but you can change that if you want. Offline defragmentation defragments the AD database that also compacts the database to improve performance. So the online one will do everything but compact the database. The offline will also compact the database. Active Directory service must be stopped in order for that to occur. Starting with 2008, AD service can be stopped for performing maintenance and then restarted. It could not do that prior to that. Microsoft refers to this as restartable AD. And compaction is done using the ntdsutil command. So you see ntdsutil is sort of like a Swiss Army knife of various different things when it comes to Active Directory. And I have used it a lot in my career. Definitely something you want to be aware of. AD metadata is data that describes the AD database, not the actual data. So metadata can get left over if a DC has been removed forcibly. And any attempts to install a DC with the same name will be unsuccessful until the metadata is cleaned up. So I've had to use metadata cleanup on multiple occasions. And usually that happens when you delete a domain controller, and it doesn't delete it completely or cleanly. So you got to go into using ntdsutil, do a metadata cleanup, and then select that server that did not get deleted cleanly, and then you can clean up the metadata at that point. Then you can put the same name server back in if you want. Active Directory snapshots, an exact replica of the AD database. So just like in virtual machines where you do a snapshot, say in VirtualBox, in Windows Hyper-V it's called a checkpoint, but when you're doing an Active Directory, you can create a snapshot as well. So you can activate the snapshot with DSA main. Browse the snapshot with AD users and computers or another LDAP tool and dismount the snapshot. So this shows you the steps for creating the snapshot using the ntdsutil command. You type the word snapshot and then it does it for you. So basically it takes a picture in time of Active Directory, which you can then restore if you need to. So a lot of good stuff on this one. Talked about DCs and sites, physical components of Active Directory. Talked about global catalogs and a little bit more about what they do. Read-only domain controllers, of course, universal group membership, and the important folders that have to do with Active Directory and how to restore. So that covers this module, and you know what to do at this point. We're far enough along in things, so we'll see you in our next one.